So I just want to begin by saying I'm very much an atheist, and my views are very much non-dogmatic, non-mystical, and non-supernatural in nature. However, there are similarities, structural similarities between Buddhism, specifically Zen Buddhism, and modern neuroscience, which are striking, which are undeniable, and which I think are severely under-discussed. In this video, I want to explore the conceptual similarities between Zen Buddhism and the core aspect of Zen Buddhism, which is mindfulness, and modern neuroscience, as well as technical terms within psychology, such as differentiation. And this main similarity between the two lies in the concept of the self. So when people talk about Zen Buddhism, they often use phrases such as letting go, or being present, or dissolving the ego. And these sound very aesthetically pleasing, they sound poetic, however, they don't offer much precision. They're not very specific in what they mean and in how to achieve this thing. So for the rest of this video to make sense, I need to introduce to you the main concept that we'll be discussing, which is the idea of boundaries. So when I talk about boundaries in this context, I'm talking about cognitive boundaries. So the brain is constantly being bombarded with and has to analyze a lot of data. Data such as sensations, memories, thoughts, emotions, and predictions. Now, with this kind of data, the brain likes to organize it into groups. This is a mostly unconscious process, and the main reason behind it is to do with energy preservation. Because if we were to analyze every single piece of data exactly equally, that would consume a lot of energy. Whereas if we can group data unconsciously into separate groups and we can then prioritize certain groups over others, we're effectively saving energy. And whenever the brain is organizing this data, it likes to label it. Now, if you think of raw sensation coming into the body, objectively it comes with no attachment. For example, let's look at something like pressure or heat. The way to label this in the most objective way is to say heat is happening. However, what the brain often likes to do is to merge that with the concept of self. And instead of saying heat is happening, most people think I am hot. So you have a raw physical sensation merged with the idea of the self, or the feeling of the self. And now that it is merged with the idea of the self, the emotion is heightened and the sensation is given a sense of urgency. A different example is the sensation of tightness in the chest. As soon as the brain labels this to a specific emotion, like fear, the brain now thinks, I am anxious. So you have this jump from a raw sensation to I am anxious, which is a fusion of different groups. Now, this thing is also a core idea within CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, but we are going to talk about that a little bit later. The same thing that I've just described can happen with thoughts as well. So thoughts, if you want to be objective about them, just appear. You don't decide what the next thought that's going to appear in your awareness is. You can try and plan it, but then the thought of the planning itself was not planned in and of itself, if you know what I mean. But this is very difficult for us to imagine because our concept or sensation of self and our thoughts that appear in our awareness are so fused. But in reality, thoughts just happen. And again, the brain doesn't like to label this as there is this content that has been revealed in my field of awareness. On the contrary, it likes to assign it to the self. I think, as opposed to a thought has occurred. So when we talk about how mindfulness fits into the modern framework of neuroscience, we can very much talk about how the brain likes to organize information and how mindfulness can reorganize that information. So let's talk about mindfulness. Mindfulness is a core concept of Zen Buddhism and is simply put about being present. The person tries to hold their attention to the present moment, usually through something like breathing, by paying attention to the breath. Mindfulness also teaches the person to be more aware of their bodily sensations and the stimuli coming around in their environment. And the same thing, most relevant to this video, is this also applies to thoughts. So thoughts just occur. Mindfulness urges you to be aware of your thoughts and to bring your conscious awareness back into the present moment. So for example, if you're sitting quietly trying to meditate and your brain starts thinking about what's happened yesterday or an argument you had, or you start planning something, or you start ruminating on something, the idea of mindfulness is for you to notice your brain doing these things and to bring them back to the present moment, usually by noticing your breath. The idea in mindfulness is that you notice the thoughts as an observer, as a neutral observer. So for example, you may be sitting there and your brain might want to repeat a scenario of you having an argument with someone yesterday. And thinking about that, your emotions might rise. You might get a little bit angry. Your job as a mindful person is to notice this anger, and for you to not say, I am angry, but for you to say, I am experiencing anger, as if you, the idea of the self, is somewhere behind your eyes, observing all of the thoughts and all of the sensations and all of the emotions that are currently occurring in your field of awareness. So within that field of awareness, you might hear different sounds. You might hear a car passing by, you might hear a dog barking, you might feel a sense of itching in your leg, and your job is to observe all of these physical sensations as well as mental sensations. You observe your thoughts. For example, you think, oh, did I feed my dog today, for example? And your job is not to get pushed into that direction and swung by that emotion. Your job is to pay attention to it and notice it. And for you to say, a thought has occurred to me about whether I have fed my dog today. So the goal of mindfulness is not to entirely remove thoughts, but it is to change the way that we label them and the category that we assign to them. Now, what largely dictates how much we're conscious or unconscious of within that organization of data is our attention. What falls into your immediate field of awareness is very much directed by attention. And there is a very good argument to be made that is entirely out of your control, because your attention itself is not a conscious decision that you make. What you're going to pay attention to is very much dictated by things in your nature and nurture that you have no control over. But attention is central to perception and to this assignment of groups. And I'll give an example of how influential attention is in our perception. Have you ever had a pain, a really strong pain, let's say in your arm, and you've been hurting the whole day, and finally at the end of the day you're relaxing in front of the TV, you're watching something, and you're really into the movie, like you've really lost yourself into the movie, and you're not really feeling any sensation at the moment. Your attention is fully focused on the movie, and then someone turns to you and says, "Hey, how's your arm, by the way?" And you immediately feel that pain. You are immediately back into fully feeling that pain. And now that you think about it, you realize for the past hour, it didn't hurt me because I was into that movie. And now that you've reminded me, it hurts like hell. And the reason this happens is because your attention was directed elsewhere. You did not perceive the pain. And now that your attention has been explicitly redirected into the sensation of pain, you now fully experience it again. And because attention is selective, so is perception. And mindfulness directly influences exactly that. Exactly how you try and influence and direct your attention so as to affect your perception. And this process is remarkably similar to the psychological concept of differentiation. So the word differentiation sounds very clinical, but specifically in therapy, and specifically when it comes to emotions, differentiation is basically the ability to label your feelings correctly and to be able to notice all of the triggers around you, to be able to notice your emotions going up and down, and to be able to differentiate, that's where it gets the name, differentiate your sense of self from your current emotion. Imagine someone is throwing a personal attack at you. You notice anger growing, perhaps in your chest, perhaps in your head. And if you're a person who is not very well differentiated, you are going to be consumed by that emotion. You're going to get angry and you're going to start throwing insults back at them. However, if you're a person who is differentiated, you are going to be able to tell, I am being triggered. You're going to think to yourself, I am being triggered. I am starting to become angry. And if I don't remove myself from this situation, I'm going to be consumed by this. So it is a clear separation between the idea of a self and a current emotion that is about to overtake you. Now, there is no perfect person. We all have different thresholds of when our ability to be differentiated is bulldozed through. But generally speaking, someone who has low differentiation would be much more emotionally reactive. And someone who is more differentiated is going to be much more flexible, is going to be much better at taking different perspectives and having more mental and emotional clarity. So the way that mindfulness plays into this is that it restores differentiation by separating or loosening these components which have been fused together. And I remember years ago when I first learned about differentiation, I already had an interest in Zen Buddhism. And I remember just thinking, well, this is strikingly similar to mindfulness. It was almost like a eureka moment. And I remember trying to Google if there was anything about it, and I didn't find anything. I only found one article of some woman who wrote about it. Just one article. And I remember I reached out to this woman, and we were both, she replied to me, and we were both shocked how nobody else had ever written about this, because it is so glaringly obvious. And we both had that same eureka moment of something that is so blatantly obvious, and yet nobody else has written about it. I'll try and find her article, and I'll link it down below if I find it. If you Google it now, the topic, you are going to find some research on mindfulness, and you are going to see it mentioned in the same context as differentiation. But it's not explicitly stated. So these similarities between differentiation and mindfulness are quite striking to me, and I would categorize them into 4 groups. There is the cognitive aspect, meaning that they both strive to keep components distinct without merging them into the sense of self and identity. This reduces rigidity and leads to less conflation of perception, emotions, thoughts, and identity. Second is the experiential aspect, meaning that sensations are given a sense of clarity. They both strive to notice internal events without being consumed by them. Third, there is the philosophical aspect, the idea that the self is constructed and not fixed, and that mental constructs themselves are temporary in nature. And lastly, there's the practical aspect. They both improve your emotional regulation, they both improve your attention, and they both lead to better cognitive adaptability. This obviously has a huge effect on your sense of self and identity, but also has a positive effect on all of your relationships with your friends and your family, and your overall emotional regulation, as well as your reasoning and ability to stay objective. Because obviously being able to label correctly and notice different emotions when you're trying to present a logically coherent and objective argument is obviously going to improve the better you are at differentiations, because you literally are becoming more objective. Zen Buddhists were not trying to develop cognitive models of how the brain works, but they notice something that is remarkably true, that suffering increases when we over-identify with sensations, that the self is not a fixed object, but that it is rather constantly reconstructed from sensations and predictions. And this is exactly where modern neuroscience is, specifically when it comes to trying to understand what consciousness is. Now, this is a topic I'm immensely interested in, and if I started to expand so much, this video will become way too long, so maybe I should leave it for another video. But conscious experience, the idea of consciousness or the idea of the self, one of the best theories that we have in regards to this is to do with predictive processing. And predictive processing is the idea that the brain constantly tries to build models of the world around it in order to predict it and better understand it and preserve energy in doing so. That the brain is a pattern-seeking machine and a predictive processing machine. And in that sense, the self is indeed constantly being reassembled by different models that the world has, different internal models that the brain has about the external world, based on which it shapes human experience, based on which you perceive who you are. So similar conclusions are reached through 2 quite different ways. And these similarities are, to me, quite striking. Now, all of these concepts within Zen Buddhism, and specifically mindfulness, also tie conceptually very well with CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. This is another example of how neuroscience and psychology share conceptual similarities with mindfulness. CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, is a model that works on the premise that there is a cycle between your perception, thoughts, emotions, and behavior. So you have a bodily sensation, you immediately give it a label of an emotion. That emotion has to be justified in your thoughts, so that is another label that's put on top of it, and that directly influences your behavior. And your behavior acts then in a type of a self-fulfilling prophecy, that your behavior now influences your bodily sensations and your emotions, which then reinforce each other in a vicious cycle. This is the core principle of CBT, and you can see how that ties into mindfulness and Zen Buddhism perfectly as well. Now, even though mindfulness shares this conceptual core with both the idea of differentiation and the model of CBT therapy, it itself is often used in therapy on its own. It is often integrated in CBT, so the person is receiving CBT, but they're also trained in how to do mindfulness meditation, and they're encouraged to do it. And not just CBT, mindfulness meditation is encouraged by a lot of therapists in a lot of different situations. It's been proven to be able to reduce symptoms of anxiety, certain ruminations in not just anxiety, but mood disorders. It can reduce some symptoms within ADHD. So basically, yes, it exists in therapy, and it is used as part of a lot of different types of therapies. So even though mindfulness exists in a lot of therapies, I feel like the way that it's being thought of by the general population is as some technique for reducing stress. Whereas a term such as differentiation just sounds like some neutral, clinical, technical term. But in reality, I've never heard anyone discuss in depth their conceptual similarities. The fact that these things are so integrally linked and similar is, I think, not widely discussed enough. And I find it quite shocking because it's so obvious to me. So whether you call that no self or differentiation in practice, I don't know if that really matters, if the end result is the same. I think when it comes to modern neuroscience and a lot of religions or philosophies, when we get to the core ideas, I think a lot of disagreements, not all of them, but a lot of them, comes down to how we label the same arguments. Even if we're giving the same argument there and we're reaching the same goal, we just like to label them differently. And some people prefer to speak in more mystical terminology and talk about dissolving the ego and things like that, which it feels cooler to sound more mystical. But I tend to prefer the more almost sterile, if you will, the more neutral ones, because they carry less baggage. Because the more mystical something sounds, the more emotional baggage it carries. And the more neutral terms are, ironically, more differentiated.